Hello, dear LinkedIn community. It's been. I guess this is the last day actually of the Supply Chain Summit officially, with all the content that we've been going on, and I'm very excited to have quite a special panel today. And it's actually the first time that we're doing it in this format for a LinkedIn Live. We have three great panelists today to share with us about integrated business planning, and I will briefly introduce them to you. And then I'll tell you more. So on one side we have Knut Alicke, who is a partner at McKinsey in the Stuttgart office in Germany. He's also the leader of the supply chain management practice for Europe at McKinsey. Knut, pleasure to have you with us, and thanks for making the time.
Sure, pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Then we have Conrad Bauer, who is the Vice President of Supply Chain and Operations at Thermo Fisher Scientific, joining us all the way from Boston, from USA, quite early in the morning. So thanks a lot, Konrad, for joining us today.
Thank you.
And on the other side, we have Stephan de Barse. Well, many of you already know Stephan quite well because he has had a great presentation at the summit. He's also sat on the panel. He's the Executive Vice President in charge of all go-to-market activities for O9 Solutions. As you know, one of the leading software providers in supply chain, across supply chain in the world. So Stephan, thanks a lot for joining us again.
Awesome. Hey, thanks, Radu. Pleasure to be here again.
So, guys, the topic for today is integrated business planning, and we have a lot of sharing. I mean, you're all experts in your field, and I think this is a topic of real relevance in business today. Before we begin, I want to encourage all the people that are watching us to post, as usual, your comments with questions on the LinkedIn Live, because we will be addressing those questions. So just post your question or comment or feedback or criticism, whatever it may be, feel free, and then I will address it with the panel. And I wanted to start, Knut, with you, because I know that McKinsey recently did a study on the supply chains in this context of COVID-19 and what has happened. You've interviewed quite a few, I think it was 80 senior executives around supply chain in executive positions across the globe. So maybe let's start there. Tell us a little bit about the findings. I know there was some interesting statistics that came out of that, and what's the overall conclusions?
Yeah, happy to do so. Thanks a lot, Radu. So indeed, we interviewed heads of supply chain because we wanted to understand what went on and what will you see being different going forward. And there's a couple of interesting findings, and especially in terms of IBP integrated planning. So what we learned is that roughly half of the people said that, look, we had some delays, we had problems in planning, and this is typically the companies where you have like Excel-based planning, weekly MRPs, not necessarily integrated in an end-to-end way. And these people said also that we basically often wake up in the morning and did not really know whether we can produce, right? Because we did not know whether we have enough raw material in place. And then the other half, roughly the other half, said that, look, it was quite interesting. We integrated our plannings processes. We have set up our IBP SNOP process. So we sent our people home, they worked from home, and everything worked fine. So there was no need to worry from a planning perspective. We even increased our planning cycle. So from a monthly planning cycle to weekly planning cycle, or even every day, every 2 days, and that worked fine. So that was quite interesting in terms of how they managed the crisis itself. Then we asked what's going to happen in the future. Are you going to change your supply chain planning approach? And here, 3 interesting findings. Because the increase of the frequency did work so well, roughly 50% that said we will keep it. So we will keep our higher planning cycles. We will kind of switch from monthly to weekly, because that gives us an agility that we need. With this, we are much more successful. Then people said, look, the production planner does not need to sit next to the production line. So what we can do, we can kind of centralize planning. We can have shared service center for planning. And with this, we can kind of build up much more capabilities centrally. And that's what roughly 58% said. So here also quite interesting in terms of the organizational structure, the supply chain operating model, we will see a shift. And then the third one was that 60% that said that they will kind of push more advanced analytics, because it was also clear the more data we have and analyze in a smart way, the better we are in terms of planning. So this is something they said. And then maybe last comment, we also asked, do you have the right talent to do that? And here, very, very clear, it was like 90% of the heads of supply chain we interviewed said, look, we need to make sure that we increase our digital supply chain talent. And roughly 70% said that they clearly want to re-skill their existing workforce. And a bit more than 50% said, hey, we also need to look outside our company to increase the capability and to build this digital talent.
And I want to shift a little bit to Konrad, because I mean, from a Thermo Fisher scientific perspective, you produce some pretty complex products, right? And measuring equipment and laboratory equipment and all of that. So I wanted to say, from a manufacturing perspective of very complex supply chains across the world, and you sitting on top, how was this for you, managing this in the middle of COVID, and how does IBP play a part in it?
Thanks for that question. I think if you look at our portfolio, we had a twofold risk, right? We had the one that we actually had a few products which spiked in demand and which we need to scale 40 times and more. And on the other hand, we had the risk of our supply chains in there. When Knut is referring to the challenges, I think we had challenges, but we didn't have stoppages. The reason for that is we started very early when the China crisis hit to actually manage it, because we have a heavy footprint in China. And that informed kind of our whole supply chain to make sure we're adapting and we're tracking it. So we started already at the beginning of February with weekly pulsing on what is our raw material situation, what is our situation in different lanes, and especially on the freight lanes, where would you have disruptions, etc. So I think a part of the importance of IBP is to start early and to actually take your first signals and make sure you're using them throughout such a crisis. The second thing I think, which is very true, is we increase our frequency on everything, right? So you couldn't go anymore to monthly. You actually needed to look at it more or less daily or weekly. So what we kind of did is saying, let's look at it on a weekly level. Let's have a weekly alignment of all the supply chain. But whenever there came a major event or a lockdown, you obviously had to set up a structure which manages daily. And that was also a collaboration, I would say, where it was not only about supply chain, but it was also about the incident management of the company. How do you actually deal with your coronavirus in your different sites yourself? Because we all had the challenges that it's the first time we had a pandemic which actually got into our sites. And inform yourself on, okay, where are the hotspots? How do I deal with that, etc. So for me, from an IBP perspective, what became more interesting as well is you actually needed all those heat maps of WHO and others to just understand, where does it strike next? Where do I have to be extra careful? And where do I have to watch closer than not? Because you can't watch your whole network.
Stephan, I want to kind of build upon the point of Konrad, but also take one or two of the questions that I see are popping up. And the questions are in terms of, would you advocate for a centralized, decentralized demand planning kind of centers? Felix from Mexico is actually asking us also, you know, how deep would you go, right? Would you go to your subsidiaries? Would you go to your partners? Would you go to, you know, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think on that demand planning question, Radu, I think, and also to Konrad's point, right? What is very important is understanding what drives your demand, right? And if you are in a CPG industry or in a pharmaceutical industry, or if you're a retailer or an industrial manufacturer, the drivers of demand will be different, right? But the key notion is we need to get closer to those drivers of demand. And very often, there's a lot of data available around those drivers. So if I'm a CPG company selling into retail, I want to know what are my competitor promotions, what is my competitor pricing, and so forth. If I'm a B2B industrial manufacturer, I might look into an opportunity pipeline that my sales is maintaining in CRM. And then there might be macroeconomic factors that are impacting my demand. So if I am a retailer ultimately selling to the end consumer, right, I would like to know What about the local demographics close to the stores that I'm operating? What about pricing, promos, social media, and so forth? So the entire notion is, when we think about demand planning, let's first think about having the end customer in mind and start building sort of those data sources that are telling me something about the drivers of demand. Then the notion is, right, we can utilize those drivers into, for instance, different machine learning models that can better predict, right, the future. Now, obviously, that cannot be a black box, so we need to make that explainable. In other words, for every driver that I put into the model, can I sort of explain the driver importance, and can I make that visual to the end user? And then actually the location where a demand planner is based is not so relevant anymore. It's about getting to the drivers of demand, starting to utilizing them, and working together with the account sales teams, with the marketing teams, with ultimately the customer, to doing this joint business planning. And I think that is extremely important. I think to Knut's point earlier, location doesn't really matter anymore. We can actually centralize much more. It's about, where can I find the data? Can I turn the data into analytics and into insights? And then I can expose that those insights back to the people that I would like to collaborate with, my sales teams, my customer, and my marketing teams, to ultimately get a better understanding of the risks and opportunities in the market, get a better sort of understanding of the drivers of demand, and hence have the ability to create different scenarios and make better decisions.
Great pointers. And Knut, I want to ask you, because we're talking about integrated business planning. Well, before it was SNOP and so on. But in reality, and actually during the summit, we had one of the participants in the panel. I will not name necessarily the company, but it's a major consumer goods company that you would all, and we would all know the name if I said it. They were very pleased in some ways that they have finally managed after 2 or 3 years to implement an SNOP type of a planning process to the overall company, right? So whilst we do, there's very advanced tools, right? The O9 is one of them available. There seems to be a big lag in terms of companies actually adopting it and integrating this planning process. So why do you think they're sometimes they're not acting that fast, right? Why do you think that happens? No?
So there's a couple of reasons, and it's a very good question. Even in a lot of our clients where we have something like an integrated planning process, some call it SNOP, some call it even IBP, some call it different. It's often not working, right? Because people still think and act in their silos. The understanding of supply chain, so the capabilities of supply chain, is not necessarily there. And then very often there is also no infrastructure in terms of governance, processes, and the IT system. So the companies who are able to implement it and who manage, and indeed the comment of it took them 2 to 3 years, I think is very, very valid. Whenever we look into this process, it always takes, let's say, the quick implementation is something like 1.5 years. Normally it's like really 2 to 3 years. And it's super important that it's not only a play of process or only a play of IT, but it's a lot of people that you need to convince. You need to build the capabilities of people. You need to convince people. You need to align the incentives. You need to set up the governance model. So often change the organizational setup a little bit to make sure that everyone understands that we need to work together. So sales need to understand that, yes, we are contributing, we are working together. Supply chain cannot only take this nerdy view of, hey, give me the numbers and I do everything. But we need to kind of be helpful for the business. So all of this needs to be in place, and only then it can be implemented successful. And this is what we see with a lot of companies. Is not yet happening. So there's a lot to do, and I hope that COVID was a little bit of a wake-up call that supply chain is important, and now we can start to implement more end-to-end planning processes.
Konrad, let me turn to you, because obviously you have implemented, and Thermo Fisher is a good example. In your past experience, you might have been exposed to this. To build on the point of Konrad, how can you, because that alignment is crucial, and it also that kind of stakeholder, maybe sometimes C-level, board level, right? They need to buy into it so that they can I don't want to say push, but let's just say that make sure that everybody is, understands that there's something very concrete that they can win, right? Whether it's sales, marketing, planning, supply chain, and so on. So maybe you can share some tips of what worked, what didn't work in Thermo Fisher, and what you've seen also in your career that works and didn't work to best align these stakeholders to push this type of initiatives forward.
Thanks. So if I build on what Knut said, I think the first thing is that's on us in supply chain. We need to change our language. The thing is, we trained ourselves so well. If you look in a lot of demand meetings of, let's talk forecast accuracy, let's talk buyers, let's talk this. If you look to a salesperson or a marketeer, he's going to look at you as like, what do you actually want from me? So we need to bring value to the table and actually say, why do we want to discuss this? Why is this important? And we also need to be realistic. If you have a forecast accuracy of 65, 70%, how far do you think really you can push it? And by the way, you better look in your data set and ask yourself, how much impact can you create if you push it from 70 to 72? That might cost you a fortune, a lot of energy, and doesn't bring you very far. That's my first thing. So make sure you actually talk the language which everybody understands and you're not in a technical mood. The second one is, how do you get to the data set? So we all have ERP systems, or most of us, and Knut worked with companies, and I think all of us work with companies where sometimes you have very integrated ERP system, or at the moment we at Thermo Fisher, for example, we don't, but that's actually not the question. The question is, how do you get a clean data set? And that's the least sexiest topic in any company, to actually work on master data and clean them up. But I'm sorry, even if I look at all the tools today, if you don't do that hard work first, you're not going to get to a good IBP process, because you actually need to understand what you're talking about, and you need to be clear that this is working. And you can't do, to Knut's point earlier, with the 50% of companies who didn't do well, you can't do it all in Excel. So that would be my second point. Make sure you actually have a robust data set, you can have the right discussion. And then I think the third one is prioritize what is actually relevant in that current situation. I think the lack in the past of many of our S&OP processes or IBP processes is they all follow the one standard, which is correct. If you have to manage the S&OP process or the IBP, you have to go through the full data set. But if you think about the meetings which you're going to have with your commercial colleagues, focus on the topics which are actually of relevance and bring value to the business, instead of going through it all, which comes a little bit back to my first point. Be clear on what you bring to the table and what your message is, and don't get lost in too many data and too many details, which basically you might understand, but many people around the table have a lot of other stuff on their table. So you need to focus them and be clear in your communication.
And actually we've gotten this question, so I'm going to throw it to you, Stephan. And it's funny how it's just building upon each other's points. So I love that. So Dice is actually asking, how do you decide, what Konrad is saying, what data is relevant, right? What data is valuable? So Dice's question is, how do you actually decide which data is valuable for the company, which it isn't, and basically what KPIs and data truly make an impact, at the most impact to the business?
Yeah, I think excellent. And actually, I completely agree with what Konrad is saying. But I think there is a sort of fresh approach that you now can take to master data cleansing. So a lot of times we look into, okay, we want to clean the data, right? But that is obviously a very broad statement. Because the question is, what are we trying to clean? And very often, sort of, you don't know what you don't know. In other words, right, if I don't have sort of clear prioritize what I want to clean, then it becomes very tough to do. So I think the first thing is when you look into, very simplistic, right, your supply chain, there's critical master data that you have. You have your bill of material, you have your bill of distribution, you have your routings, and so forth and so forth. Now, what we see, not many companies have a harmonized ERP. Many have different ERPs. But still, if they have one ERP, that master data is often not clean. So my lead times, right, they might have been keyed in once in the past and have never been updated, as well as, many other master data sort of core elements. So then the question is, are you going to assign a workforce to clean that? Or can you now leverage technology to help you cleaning that? And I think that is where we've seen some great results. The moment I would connect with, for instance, transactional data, I can detect and say, hey, this lead time is not 4 weeks, it's actually 5 weeks. based on transactional data, for instance. But the issue is, if you're still planning according to 4 weeks, you're sort of in a firefight mode, from day one. So I think cleansing data is absolutely key, but I think there are smart ways now to do so by using, for instance, real-time data or transactional data to cleanse that. So that helps you getting sort of a clear understanding of and a clean understanding of your entire network. Then it comes down to sort of how do I get closer to my supply disruptions as well as my demand disruptions. And that is where, again, we need to look into, what is the company that I'm working for, what is the product that I'm selling, who's my end consumer, what drives my demand, and get demand driver information. Similarly, on the supply side, right, what are the risks on the supply side? Is it single source, dual source? Are there a lot of companies competing for the same raw material and so forth? And based on that, again, data, you can bring that together and make better decisions. So I absolutely agree that in order for any analytics or good IBP process to work, we need to have good data. But I think there is a fresh approach to solving sort of the traditional data challenges. And that is by taking real-time and transactional data, as well as cleansing algorithms to do that. And then I think to Konrad's point, so much agree to that. Don't come with, a 100-page PowerPoint deck to the sales organization discussing accuracy and bias, the lowest level of detail, because supply chain professionals tend to like to talk at the SKU level. But salespeople, they can care less about the SKUs. They are looking into how can I sort of grow my market share. And those are different discussions. And that is where I think, supply chain professionals really need to sort of step up. That's why S&OP starts with S from sales, or, IBP, right? We often forget that it starts with an I. So how can we, sort of bring that together, become relevant? And my personal belief is, that has to do with sort of the mindset in an organization. IBP being a process that is shared by supply chain, finance, and commercial together, and enabling technology that allows you to make better decisions.
Knut, I see that you're roaring to go. I might have misread, but did you want to say something, Knut?
I was just kind of adjusting my glasses. Okay. It was more kind of I fully agree, and it's interesting when you think about what Konrad said on communication, right? When you think about how much budget do supply chain managers kind of put aside to learn to communicate, or how do we kind of tell the story? How do we make sure that we are not talking about, hey, I increased my truck utilization by 1.5%, but telling the story that really matters in business, right? And that's what we don't do, right? That's interesting. I asked a lot of my clients, how much kind of budget do you put aside to improve the supply chain communications, the internal marketing? And that's nothing. So here's clearly something that we all can do much better.
And I just want to share across, so we've had 13 panels, right, for the Supply Chain Summit. We had 13 panels on different topics, you name it, right, so of interest. There was one question that I made sure in one form or another I asked everybody, and that question was what type of skills, and I would want you to answer that later on as well. What types of skills, or what's one skill that you would want supply chain professionals to have? And you know what was the common answer to that? Of course, there were several answers, but there was one that came up on every panel, and that answer was storytelling skills, communication skills, presentation skills. And it's exactly what you guys are sharing right now, which is, how do you make sure that you're not talking 1.5% truck utilization, asset utilization, all these things that are like, all right, so what? What's in it for me, right? I mean, as a sales guy, like, how does that help me? How does it help the business? And we've literally had a client recently that invested in their supply chain, and they were all trained into how do you present, how do you influence without authority. I mean, it's fancy words at the end of the day, but I think that the meaning is clear, right? How do you come across to the peers and what's in it for them, and then together come to resolve bigger bigger issues for the companies. Now I want to ask you to stay with you a little bit, Knut, also for the executive level, board level discussions, right? let's go a little bit deeper in that, and we have a lot of good questions as well. But I wanted to ask you this: what do they actually? Do they even know this phrase IBP? What do they know? What do they understand? What do they think of IBP?
Yeah, very good question, and I would say that depends a bit on the industry. So you gave the example of this consumer goods industry or consumer company. Here, supply chain has a bit of a history, right? So there's even chief supply chain officers, which often, if you look into discrete manufacturing, you rarely find, right? So probably Konrad is one of the exceptions. And other industries like pharmaceutical is somewhere in between, kind of catching up, doing cool stuff. And so that's where you have some of the executives of the board clearly understand supply chain, right? And I recently had a chat with a colleague who is now managing the supply chain for a consumer goods company in Asia, and he said, look, there is a correlation of understanding of supply chain and dirty tricks of the board. So basically, kind of making sure that you, at the end of the month or the quarter or the year, you reduce kind of your inventory, right? And so you kind of do this polishing. If the board understands supply chain, they don't do this, and the EBIT is higher, right? And he in his spare time did do this correlation analysis with something like a small sample size, 10, 15 companies. So quite interesting. So I would say that there are companies where it is known. If it's not the term IBP, at least the concept of, hey, we need to work together. We are end-to-end, we are integrated. We understand trade-offs. We do scenario calculation. We do scenario analysis. But the majority still does not understand. So there is, again, this communication topic. Make it clear and also show the business impact of this super important process.
Thanks for bringing it kind of pragmatic level, because I kind of sense that as well. But obviously, you guys at McKinsey, you interact with a lot at that level. And I mean, it's not necessarily to say that it's about words and terms, but it's more. I mean, I guess what you said is the end to end. As long as they get the importance of that, that's as good as whether they call it IBP, SNOP, or flower power, whatever it is, right? It's the key is to understand the concept. Konrad, I also wanted to come to you from a perspective of future, right? Where do you see this going? Like in, I don't know, 2 to 5 years down the line at Thermo Fisher, what type of capabilities would you want to further enhance or inbuild in your integrated business planning process?
So I think what Knut referenced before, and this is going to be the next step for most, right? Not only Thermo Fisher, it's like, how do we digitize some of the impact? I mean, if we think about what has happened in the past of centralizing certain planning functions, digitalizing certain planning functions, that I think is a question which is going to drive most of the supply chains, in the sense of, if you start at the beginning, what Stephan mentioned beforehand on how do I centralize a demand planning? How do I actually get to a certain level of excellence in that? And then there's a decision of, do I do it myself or do I actually outsource it? Because we all know that there's companies like Amazon or Google selling this as a service by now. Then how do I do the same at a certain level for production planning, which not so many people have done yet and talking about, because you get into the challenge of having the data transparency. Well, I agree to what Stephan says, like you can fix a lot of your master data issues by actually taking today's actual data sets. Production planning and especially scheduling still has this, I would say, magic portion of what is not in the system and just told on the shop floor, and you somehow need to break that part. So I think that is where we're really going to have, from a capability perspective, that means we need to build people who understand that. And I think planners will develop from a transactional planning capability to actually managing an end-to-end supply chain. And that's where we need to build the capability. So I need people who are digital interested, and I need people who actually can understand the end-to-end and know what they do if they change one of the screws. Let's take an old example. Where did many of the efforts fail in the past? You tried to bring optimizers or other tools to fly, and the problem was people did not accept it because it was a black box. So instead of taking the setting which the system proposed, they said, I don't get it. It was always 10 days lead times. It was always 50 minimum order quantity. no, this is just wrong, I'm going to do it my way. And that basically broke all our efforts in the supply chains to automate in the past. So now we need to do the different way, the smarter way, not coming from the technology first, but actually coming from how do I get my people trained to understand what these systems are doing and how they understand what they're driving with it. And I think that is the part. So short answer, digital capabilities, a better end-to-end view, and more a view of the network than just of the single transaction. That's what we're going to need in the next years.
Yeah, and I think, Konrad, maybe to respond to that and also to try to tie that together, Radu, with storytelling. I think, to your point, Konrad, I completely agree. If you look at the traditional sort of supply chain, there is a supply chain master planner. Then there is someone that is taking care of the sort of operational planning. And then obviously in the factories, we find production planners taking care of the production scheduling and sequencing. And then on the demand side, we have the demand planner that is working with the sales organization, and potentially we have someone that runs some stat model. So we actually have sort of five core roles. And what we are seeing is also the need to have more of a network end-to-end planner. And that is also where we can start looking into, becoming more relevant for the sales organization. So let me give you sort of two examples. One is we are let's say in industrial company, and we are selling, business to business complex systems. And what we often see is that the demand planning organization is working with the sales teams, looking into the opportunity pipeline, ultimately providing a forecast. That forecast goes to supply. They do the demand supply match, and ultimately it goes to the manufacturing side for manufacturing and assembly and so forth. But the issue is that no one is sort of connecting the dots, because what you would like is a salesperson enters a new opportunity. That opportunity says, I can sell this project with configuration, with module A, B, C, and D. At that moment, you want an immediate response from the supply chain team saying, hey, I've actually looked into sort of that module A, B, C, and D. The key supplier of module B has difficulties in supplying the key component. So by the way, I did some analysis and I saw that this customer or this prospect is normally okay with configuration with module A, C, D, and E. Why don't you propose that to the customer? And now you can immediately sell it. I've optimized my supply chain, and my customer and my salesperson is very happy. Now that is in a sort of a B2B environment. If we would take it into sort of a consumer goods company, let's say I'm doing my demand supply match and I see I cannot support the demand. What would every supply planner do is look into, maybe I can run a night shift, maybe I can use an alternate source, maybe I can do pre-building. That's what we call supply shaping. Why don't we look into demand shaping? So can I actually run analytics and say, hey, I cannot fulfill that order for that customer, but by the way, can I maybe substitute this product with another product? And I know that the customer historically has been okay doing that. So that entire thinking of, moving away from just supply shaping to actually demand shape, we can only do that, if we have that end-to-end picture and if we start connecting the dots.
Well, I would even strengthen that, because if you think farther than the 5 years, I think what we need to move away from is actually our SKU planning approach today. Because if you think you have a digital network and you actually would understand your supply chain, you actually start to do bottleneck planning only. So we tried that, right? We have the alert systems, etc. Everybody can judge in his own company how successful we are with alerts or not. But if you think really about having that digital supply chain, and when you think about, I would have a factory which is producing equipments where I have all my machinery in a data lake, and I actually have every sensor, and I could, also in the sense of predictive maintenance, say where is most likely my disruption, and then have a good demand signal. I could actually stop planning single SKUs, and I could start focus all my energy on the bottlenecks which happen in my network. And I think that's ultimately where we all want to go. To the question which was raised by Radu, do I think we're going to get there in 2 to 5 years? Maybe Stephan thinks we do. I'm more realistic, and I say it's still going to take us a bit more time.
And Konrad, I think you raise a very interesting idea, and this is kind of what everyone is now kind of pushing, this whole digital twin, where the manufacturing guys tried to do this like 20 years ago, right? And it took them many years, and now we are kind of there. In supply chain, we are talking about this since a few years. And if I just kind of envision the future of having this digital twin, and then you kind of go from, hey, I plan every single SKU as you say, not only to bottleneck, but you kind of the system, so to say, would tell you, hey, please check this and this and this and this, because here you have bottlenecks, yet that even you don't know. You would also extend the supply chain to first tier, second tier, third tier, to be kind of proactive in risk management. You would then kind of implement all this cool stuff that Stephan mentioned in terms of the demand shaping, right? Where you say that, hey, I expect this demand, we cannot fulfill. Maybe we should already now inform our salespeople that they should rather sell something else with a bit of a discount. So all of this is possible. And everything we talked about is necessary to do that, right? So we need to have the right data quality, we need to have the right infrastructure, people need to understand, board, supply chain needs to understand, and we need to work end to end.
Just let me add one, because I think there's one important, and we have to focus on what we really need. Because I think a lot of the problems I see with digital twins at the moment is everybody wants to do everything, instead of saying, okay, let's focus on the few things first, and then let's take it from there. Because we have this technical geek thing of supply chainers, and I'm one of those who says like, oh yeah, let's do it all, it's great. And then you're just like, yeah, maybe it's a little bit too much to handle.
I wanted to, there's questions popping up, and there's one in particular that seems to be getting a lot of popularity, so I want to throw it at you. You actually mentioned it just now, Knut. The question goes like this: how much do you think we're gonna see integration of tier 1, tier 2 suppliers into this IBP? How easy is that to be done? The question also goes to say that maybe in CPG, FMCG, there's quite a bit of that done already, but in other industries they're fairly behind. And how do you kind of convince your tier 1, tier 2 what's in it for them to give you that data, right? Because it's that. So I'll throw it at you. I don't necessarily have any of you can pick it up.
So let me maybe start with this. It's quite interesting. I did before McKinsey, I did work in a small planning company where we did do this to the tier 7 for the automotive industry. But that was a super deep crisis where the OEM really had to stop the assembly line, and then they pushed it through, and it was working for 1 year. Problem was solved, and then it was gone, right? So this whole transparency thing. Now with COVID, everyone is asking again for, hey, what is happening in my tier 2, tier 3, tier 4? And the challenge indeed is that to create this transparency, it is possible, right? So you kind of you ask for the data, but the problem is that why would a tier 2 share this data with the OEM, or a tier 3 with the OEM? There's just a lot of fear that this data will be misused. So what is necessary is that it's a masked provision of data. We need to make sure that we maybe even have a third party that uses this data. So there's, after Fukushima, a very interesting case where the Automotive Association in Japan did allocate short components, right? So that was a third party that tried to do the fair allocation of parts, right? Something like this. So I expect, and I don't have an answer yet. Maybe Stephan comes around and says he has the tool, but I don't have the answer yet. But it's a topic that we discuss, I would say, with every second client, especially after COVID. So there's a demand, there's a need. There's no really good solution yet. I'm sure that there will be something developed in the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, and I think, Knut, to that, I actually don't think it's a technology challenge. To your point, it's sort of why would they do that? And I think, from our experience doing a couple of those projects on the tier 2, 3 sort of connect, what is in for them? Obviously, what do they want? They want an accurate forecast. Why do they want an accurate forecast? Makes their lives much easier. Because if you look at the entire channel, everyone is sort of building up that buffer stock, right? Taking away capital that can be invested in other things. And when you have this sort of variability in the entire chain, it sort of adds up and it becomes extremely complex to measure. So I think the moment you start collaborating better with suppliers, ultimately should result in you having the ability to provide a more accurate forecast. Hence, should be an incentive to sort of to work. And I think that's also something that I always find pretty unique about Amazon's business model. They have their sort of digital connect with the end consumer as well as with the supplier. So what they actually do, they build up deep supplier knowledge in terms of reliability, in terms of material availability, and so forth. And on the customer side, they do the same. What is the sort of price sensitivity? What is the sort of, what are the different demand levers and so forth? So the moment you connect all that knowledge with sort of a digital brain where you apply planning and analytics, now you can start shaping demand and supply. And I think it's a very interesting topic. I don't think it's necessarily a technology sort of a constraint. I think it's actually fairly easy to do. It's about why would they participate? My personal belief is, yeah, that accurate forecast and reducing their buffer stocks is a big one.
Okay, but I think technology-wise, process-wise, okay. Here's your real challenge. You have a supplier, he has multiple customers. If not all of the customers play the same game, you actually can't get the information. And if I take your Amazon example, Stephan, if Amazon threatens me when I have a product on their marketplace that if I don't hit their delivery metric to bury me on page 2, and you can't get much more deep buried at the page 2 because nobody's going to click at that. It's actually a problem because somebody's gaming the system in the sense. Somebody's putting pressure on your supply chain, which then brings your model out of sync again. And I think that's our problem at the moment with the full integration of suppliers. It's not the digital data exchange. It's more like I have one line, let's say I have 5 customers on there. If one of the customers puts huge pressure on the supplier to deliver or throws money at him, he's going to do that. And my whole model goes bust. And I think that is where there's still a problem in that. It's easier if I had dedicated lines. So to Knut's example, because I started in the automotive industry, the automotive industry in that sense is much farther ahead because you usually have very dedicated lines and equipments on that. But if you come into the chemical industry where, for example, you have just batch processes and it's multiple purpose equipment, it's not that easy any longer because you get and we tried that, you get a commitment from a supplier on a certain tonnage, but you actually do not, or you actually do know it's not the technical constraint. It's just going to be, that's what he allocated today in his MRP to us, which doesn't mean if somebody comes around tomorrow, he might allocate something else.
It almost also sounds to me, if I can summarize a little bit, both on this point as well as what you've discussed previously, with how long will it take for us to, and for the industry to move forward. It's not a technology issue, it's a mindset and skills issue. Actually, fundamentally, it's a mindset issue first and foremost, because skills we can pick up, I guess, but mindsets are the hardest to change for us as human beings, right? So first, we don't know what we don't know. So if you don't even have the definition of IPP, or you don't know it exists, then well, it's a bit of an issue, right?
But Radu, I think to that point, right, and I would love to get also all of your perspective on that. So yesterday I was in this in a call with a big prospect, and we are going through a couple of use cases. And the feedback that we often get is like, oh wow, this seems like a big change. We are not ready for this, right? So I asked the audience, have you ever used Uber in your life? Everyone says, yeah, sure, I do that all the time. Great. Have you ever booked something on Airbnb? Yeah, we've all done that, right? Okay. Do you use Google Maps if you need to find a restaurant? Yes. Do you leave behind a review on Yelp? Yes. Would you adapt new technology in the enterprise? No, I go to Excel. Right? So there's something that I cannot make up, why we are so sort of accepting all those new technologies, right, all the time in our daily lives. But then in the enterprise, we find it so tough to make that change. And that is something that I still have not figured out why that is. Because we do it and we don't. It's sort of, I close the door at the office and I want to use the newest technology. I walk in the following morning, I go back in time.
Yeah, Stephan, I think it's a good example, and I feel it's changing. I had a similar discussion like 5 years ago or so or 10 years when Amazon started to build their customer-centric model. where we talked about digital, we talked about customer integration, and all the B2B companies said back then, they said, yeah, but you know, we are not B2C, we are not Amazon, we don't need this. 2 years later, 3 years later, when their customers all ordered on Amazon, unfortunately, the customers asked them to have exactly the same experience. So we were back at the discussion, and now the understanding was kind of by just experiencing and being pushed. So I hope that it will change indeed.
And coming back to the question on the mindset, Stephan, the question is, the mindset in that industry is scale or fail fast. So you basically try something, either you scale it fast because it works, or it fails fast and you just scrap it, right? It's the whole thing about agile and so on. And I think that's the mindset you need to get into the companies. Companies are at the moment risk catching. Would I invest into a tool which costs me so much X, and I'm not even certain on my benefit out of it? I have better investments to do with my money, and that's where I'm out. And that's, I think, where the topic is on, if you want to lead on that, you have to have a culture of scaling and failing fast, and then do it. Or on the other hand, you have the culture of the typical, and that's a typical culture of big companies on, do I invest in it? Does it give me my return on investment, or do I have a better investment? And both has their reasons to be there, correct? So the question is, how do you actually join up these forces to be successful in that element?
I'll just chip in a little bit more controversial angle, Stephan. My impression, to a certain degree, there's a lot of shall I use the politically correct term? Or, I mean, I think there's also a lot of fear in organization that I don't want to fuck it up. So I use the politically correct term. I think there's also all this politics in big organizations, and there's only that much amount of risk that you're willing to take, right? Obviously, your jobs, your careers, there's a lot of things that are at stake. Whereas as an individual, right, okay, if I lose $10 on an Uber, okay, fair, more or less, I can live with that. So that's one aspect that I have seen. But second aspect, which gives me to shift it on the positive, which I'm seeing, and again, I don't want to name, but you know, there's plenty of such examples where companies are shifting to a model where they're trying out on a small scale, right? So let's try it for 1-2 plants, I don't know, whatever it may be. We actually had somebody that said, okay, we did this master data cleansing, to your point, Konrad, bloody boring. We lost all our hair, and we we ripped it to pieces. But ultimately, because we got results, then we went to the next plan and said, look, guys, you're gonna hate this, but here's the increase in blah, here's the decrease in blah, here's what you get. And then they have a case study, right, to prove that it works, and then they can convince them. But it's this start small. It's almost the Amazon mentality to a certain degree, but again, it boils down to culture, because if the executive level doesn't instill the right culture of fail, and it's okay to fail, then it ain't going to happen. And there's just some companies that unfortunately have that. But there's other companies that are, more or less experimenting on a small scale and then scaling up if it works. So I think there's definitely a positive. And to Knut's point, that B2C model, and to all of you guys' point, right? I mean, I'm dealing with freight forwarding companies, for example, and you get a delivery. If you order your food, you know where the driver is delivering your food. But if you order, I don't know, 1 ton of medical equipment from China, you have no idea where is it, on the boat, on the plane, where the heck is it, right? So I think that's an industry that is kind of ripe for disruption, because people are requiring the same type of analytics or visibility that a B2C consumer company would require. So I want to end this conversation, because we are drawing to a close, but I want to end by asking all of you, Knut, your study says 90% of the companies that you surveyed, right, want to invest in skills and want to bring it in-house and want to upskill their people. Stephan, you've talked about end-to-end, that mindset of end-to-end versus just, demand planner or supply chain planner or whatever it may be. So how do you do that, right? I mean, let's talk about, how do you develop these skills? Do you have some ideas? Have you seen stuff that work better than others? Maybe in Thermo Fisher, if you have some programs already in place, Konrad, let's open up a little bit on this topic.
Sure. So I think the first thing is, if you ask me what do you want for skills, it is about you need people who can communicate in supply chain. You need people who are getting more and more familiar with digital and who want to embrace it. And you need people who have a network view and a more holistic view of the supply chain. And last but not least, they understand the business, because I don't need just technology junkies. I think the one thing where I make the caveat is on the digital natives. I think I need people who are curious to do it, and then we're going to go on a joint journey in a development program, because the topic is, if you would bring people, and Knut and I had such discussions before, if you would bring in, let's say, a lot of people who worked at Google before in a classical industry company, they would not survive long, because they would just be not getting along with the culture. So you basically need to make sure you get digital competencies within in the culture within your company is in. On the development, I think because the war from talent is on, we have development programs. So we have leadership development programs and such, and that's where you really need to do it. So you need to invest the training of your own people, because the market for supply chain experts in that sense is empty. We have a lot of planners, and even if I've tried to find a planner today in the markets, or if I try to find somebody who has a network planner, it's very hard. So there is something where every company will have to invest in it, because I think the market is just too empty to say I'm not doing anything about it.
Yeah, would agree. And so what we typically do in large scale transformations is that let's say one standard piece, and that is not only kind of a couple of days, but one very important piece is the whole upskilling, and this is a combination of something where you have, let's say, normal, sometimes boring lectures, being a professor myself, but then you also have a lot of kind of more advanced stuff where you have digital courses, right, where you kind of take people on the journey. You do field and forum, where you kind of have small tasks where people execute. You need to do a lot of coaching. So the good head of supply chain of the future is also a very good coach, right? Because you can explain, you can take people along the journey. They have success, they have early success. And then it's also interesting, everyone talks about data scientists and not being available. We did help a client where we looked into where do we have these profiles in the company? And we found out that the most data scientists, as you would expect, are in R&D, right? And then we were able to kind of convince a couple of these cool guys to join the supply chain. They were clearly new to supply chain. That is something they could pick up quite fast, but they had the data science capabilities. So also here being creative, right? Being creative and having new ideas of getting talent and also developing talent. Very important. Often someone who starts a career in supply chain starts as a planner, and after being a planner, you are the head of supply chain, and that's it, right? So now kind of more companies opening up to board positions also for supply chain people, also super, super important to kind of show that, hey, you can advance, right? And then if you kind of go through the supply chain, then kind of understanding end to end is something that you kind of naturally bring along.
And I think maybe to conclude, I think supply chain is one of the coolest spaces when it comes to actually tech, because the problem that you need to solve is not easy. And I think if you're able to solve that, combining high quality people, fantastic organization and cool technology, then this is the space you want to be in. And I think that is also what we see. People are shifting, right? Because you can see that you can actually make a very tangible impact the moment, for instance, your proprietary developed algorithms are working. You see forecast accuracy improving, inventory going down, right? Impact on service levels, the ability to shape demand. So think if you're like, talented individual, sort of digital native and digital savvy, supply chain is just a super cool space to explore your skills.
No, could not agree more. And usually the more problems, challenges, and so on, the more the opportunity to make a difference. So I want to thank, on that note, I want to thank all of you. It's been a very insightful and practical and pragmatic discussion. And you will see also, you haven't seen the comments and the questions, but after this you can go and see there's been a lot of interaction. And I think a lot of the people that have watched it got a lot of value. So without being, without taking any longer of your time, I want to thank everybody for participating and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks all.
Thanks a lot.